This is the last video lecture of the semester. After this point, we're going to get into our major design project and be drawing on the content from the first 3 lectures and other discussions in class. So I hope you enjoy it. This one is I think quite an interesting lecture and drawing on lots of examples, and we're going to be doing a little bit of investigation and exploring the idea of myth, power, and politics. So thinking about some of the ideas embedded in the signs that we're putting out there, some of the messages that we're communicating that we don't necessarily think about, and sort of the ideas behind certain associations that we take for granted. So one of the concepts, or the main concept today, is this idea of myths, which are dominant and socially constructed meanings. So they're what link a sign vehicle to a referent. So, for example, wine, sometimes or often is associated maybe with Frenchness. Pink would be femininity and other things, right? But quite often femininity. Red can be power, and other things, right? But this idea of myth is kind of the dominant meanings and the dominant associations, even if there can be these other ones linked with wine and pink and red and all sorts of other signs. The first few that come to mind probably are the dominant meanings or the dominant associations that we have. And we've been drawing on these myths in our analysis throughout the semester because they're impossible to avoid. They're the way we understand our surroundings, and I think they're actually pretty essential for just navigating the world, is having these kind of known and familiar associations so that you don't have to kind of remake the link every single time you see something. It's important to sort of have this inventory of associations. So they can be really positive in that respect, but they can also be problematic, and there are, dangers and issues associated with them, as we're going to be exploring today. So they can be problematic for a few reasons. First off, society often forgets about their history and foundations, and we simply take them for granted. So why, maybe wine and Frenchness, we might have an understanding of what that's about, but why does pink mean, femininity? And why does, red mean power? I think we kind of have a sense about that, but we definitely haven't individually, or even as a society, really taken the time to sort of investigate that and think back. And sort of think about, are these things that, does this actually make sense? Or are these things that we want to be continuing, or things that are still relevant today, or things that, are somehow an issue? I don't know. So we're going to be doing a little bit of investigation along certain myths during the video today. And also this idea of these dominant messages or these dominant meanings associated with certain things can be restrictive, So perpetuating certain understandings and blocking others, and sort of sometimes eliminating this possibility for other interpretations, which can be problematic in itself. So it's important to question these links, not always, because we can't be doing this absolutely all the time, but I think as a whole, in our practice as designers, it's important that we do sort of think about the signs that we're drawing on and these meanings, and where we can question them, where they don't necessarily make sense, or where we're sort of concerned, I wonder what this is about, or I wonder if this is something that I should be doing or not. At moments like this, it can be helpful to do a little bit of investigation, to sort of think about what we're drawing on, to figure out how we feel about these links. Are these things that we're okay with as designers? Are these things that sort of make sense in contemporary culture? Do these make sense for you? And to decide if we want to do something about it, or can we even do something about it? Are these ideas that are so embedded in what we do that just there's really no way getting around them, or things like that? So I'm going to go through some examples. I'm going to go through some more general examples, and then we're going to get into a few design-specific, really specific examples later on in the lecture. So the first one is the color pink. I'm gonna share what I've read about the color pink and sort of how it came about and how it came to be associated with what it currently is. So pink, is associated with femininity, softness, cuteness, calm, care. Although that's not always the case. If you take more of like a bright fuchsia, it's more like excitement. But it really is always sort of a feminine color, right? And it's one of my favorite colors. Full disclosure, it's a fantastic color. It can be. But do we know how pink came to be associated with these things? I think we kind of have this idea that, okay, so it's a female color, it's a feminine color, women maybe are associated with these characteristics, but why is it a feminine color in the beginning? I don't really know, right? So there's been some interesting writing on that, and some historians who have sort of dug below the surface into these links and kind of tried to figure it out. So Anne-Marie Adams and Julie Irish have done some writing on the color pink. And I think it was Anne-Marie in particular who had done some research and found that before World War II, pink was associated with boys and blue was actually for girls. And I think I might have heard something about that in the past as well, where I think pink was associated as sort of this vigorous and exciting color, and blue was maybe sort of a calm color, right? Which I think has sort of certain links with gender associations. But actually this switch is really problematic if what Anne-Marie was saying is true. It's actually sort of upsetting. So apparently during World War II, Nazis we know that they identified different population groups with colors and symbols, right? And they identified gay men with the color pink, and I think specifically a pink triangle. And since about that point, color association switched, where pink is now a feminine color and blue is now a masculine or a boy's color. So Jang Mi-yoon has done these really cool photographs where it's called the Pink and Blue Project. So she photographs some little kids, little boys and little girls with some of their stuff, and she accentuates, I think, the pink. So she'll have these little girls in the room, a sea of pink like here, and she'll have little boys in a sea of blue, which just kind of ties into this idea of this pink and blue, or really kind of pushes it to the extreme, I suppose. But, when we start to think about these associations of color and gender, and this sort of link or switch that happened in the Second World War, it becomes clear that, it's drawing on stereotypes, like the link of pink and femininity, and also value judgments. So, if we're thinking about it really directly and really strictly, and we're I don't know, probably oversimplifying it, to me, it draws a lot on this idea that, gay men and straight men are, distinct or different, that there might be some sort of association between gay men and women, or a certain sort of femininity that that society, often sees or sometimes sees. And so if, gay men are associated with pink, therefore it cannot be, a masculine color anymore. It needs to be perhaps a feminine color, right? And I think it kind of shows this hierarchy between, straight men, gay men, and women also, that, if suddenly pink is associated with, the gay community, it can't be, for the straight community or the straight male community. Therefore, we're going to do that switch. Therefore, blue is going to be the color that we're going with, and pink is going to be become this, feminine color. I think that's. This is all speculation, but it sort of makes sense, and it's if as these authors are saying that switch happened at that point in time, perhaps that's what happened. I don't know. But it definitely does, regardless, it definitely does lend to this. It kind of requires this investigation. It requires us to sort of start thinking about this and thinking, oh my gosh. Like, first off, links between color and gender are so artificial, right? But also, if this is what it's coming from, wow. I mean, we employ color all the time in our projects, and we're not realizing it, but we are sort of perpetuating this, right? And is this okay? Is this something that needs to change, or is it something that somehow we've moved past, or somehow we've kind of accepted and sort of let go of this history, or this problematic history? I don't know. But it's something that I think we need to discuss as a design community, and sort of think about how should we proceed, armed with this information. We could also be thinking about colors black and white. So, Ruben Pater has a fantastic book called The Politics of Design. It's on the recommended reading list, and it's also on reserve at Bird Library. And he has a really fantastic section on, black and white, where he's done this sort of thinking, or sharing a lot of discussion actually that's already been taken place on the colors black and white and their sort of social connections, right, and the social understandings. And he links it to, racism and sort of a colonial history. So he says, Europeans started calling themselves white around the same time Africans were being sold as slaves. Categorizing Africans as black and Europeans as white established the racial hierarchy that was needed to legitimize exploitation and slavery. So he kind of says that there was this link that was made, and this link, or this categorization of people into categories of black and white, was almost sort of required to sort of explain what was happening, or just sort of legitimize it, and to sort of create this hierarchy that needed to be put in place, or at least emphasized, because I'm sure it existed previous to that as well, but that these categorizations sort of legitimized and moved forward with this process of slavery, exploitation, and colonialism, and all that sort of thing. And, as a society, we have strong associations with the colors black and white. And in fact, they're binary oppositions, right? Like, if we're thinking of binaries, which are these opposites, there's like night and day, the sun and the moon, black and white. I think those are sort of love and hate. Those are sort of the binaries that come to mind, and black and white certainly are. And certainly have these links that we understand. So Martin Luther King Jr. said in 1967, "Look in your dictionaries and see the synonym of the word black. It's always something degrading and low and sinister. Look at the word white. It's always something pure, high, and clean." These oppositions and color associations are perpetuated in visual culture. So a really easy example is good versus bad characters in films. So think about Disney heroes and villains, or think about Luke Skywalker and Darth Vader, although I've never really watched Star Wars, but I think it's an example that definitely comes up a lot. So just kind of look at the color palettes used to represent these Disney princesses versus to represent these Disney villains, right? There's a lot more sort of somber and dark colors. And just the link between a dark color and, this somberness, or this evilness, or whatever, it's, completely artificial. And it's something that Martin Luther King was talking about, this idea of, black being associated with degrading and low and sinister, and white or lighter colors being pure and high and clean. A bit like that, Disney princess, evil villain opposition. And now that we start thinking about that, and start thinking that, I think our social understandings of color and shade, do tie back to the really physical and historical realities, of the world. Now as designers, we have this information, right? we've sort of taken the time to look into it. And a bit like, the color pink, now that we have this understanding, gosh, how do we move forward? What do we do now? So that's something I want you guys to think about. And that's something that we are going to have a conversation about next class. So knowing more about the history behind these myths, how can designers proceed? Or maybe less, how can designers proceed, but maybe how will you proceed? How will this change the way that you maybe employ color in your projects? Is it something that you're going to take into consideration? Or do you think that, these associations that we have with color are so socially accepted now that, how could we possibly change them? Or what kind of a move can we make as designers that would offer this opposition? I want you guys to think about that, and it definitely is a relevant thing to be thinking about leading into your philosophy and ethics class later on in the year. So prepare some thoughts about this for next class. So I'm going to give some more design examples. We talked about color, and that's great. That's really broad and sort of abstract. It's this idea of color as it's applied to visual culture and design, sort of in a more general sense. I have some examples here about kind of more concrete and actual design projects, which are sort of interesting when you start to dig below the surface and think about these meanings and these associations, and sort of realize, gosh, this is sort of problematic, or this is, deeply problematic, right? And how do we proceed? So one example is 20th century urban planning and the interstate system. So back in I think this was happening maybe from the 30s to the 60s, there was a lot of construction of highways into cities, including Syracuse, basically for suburban commuters. And in the process, and there's a lot of documentation about this, a lot of low income and often African American neighborhoods were destroyed. So basically bulldozed to make way for these highway systems. There's a lot of discussion around this with the I-81 in Syracuse, and how that process took place in Syracuse. For example, the Pioneer homes, which I think are still there. Part of that housing complex was destroyed for the I-81 highway, and that's a very political or power-oriented move, right? Choosing whose homes are you destroying, to create this new highway that's not serving the community that you're destroying. It's serving these other people with more means, more wealth, and their ability basically to get into the city from their suburban homes and lives. So definitely that's a political move, choosing these neighborhoods. And also in a lot of cases there's discussion about how the interstate system has created a segregation within cities where, possibly on one side of the highway there's one reality and on the other side there's another reality. And I think that's also the case with Syracuse, where for the I-81 and this highway that's going north-south, there is a pretty stark division between, life on the west side of the highway, which is quite a poor neighborhood in Syracuse, versus on the east side, which is the university area and includes a lot of really grand and beautiful homes. So something that's we need to, as designers and just citizens of the world or the city, to be thinking about and to be flagging is problematic. And sort of there are discussions going on right now actually about how to deal with these highways, which now, half a century later are, in disrepair and needing to be rethought anyways. And there's a lot of discussion about, so how do we kind of move forward, and how do we deal with this system? Can we change it? What will be the impact of changing it, etc.? So there's a lot of discussion around the I-81 right now. Similarly, there's a lot of talk about Robert Moses, who is famous or infamous, and he was a sort of a high-ranking guy in sort of urban development or city planning, I think in and around New York City in the mid-century. And he was, for one way or another, involved in a lot of road construction projects and bridge projects and parks and playgrounds and housing developments and that sort of thing. And it's quite a complex situation. A lot of people have sort of weighed in and talked about, what he's done well, or sort of his legacy, which is huge. He was basically involved in, I think, pretty much every project in that time span, in and around New York City. But also there's a lot of questioning about some of the decisions he was making, and how a lot of times these were racist decisions or very biased decisions. So there's a conversation about, and I think sometimes it's oversimplified, but there is a conversation about the height of bridges that he was building around New York, and how he had asked for these bridges to be built low in certain areas, which would prevent, or which is sort of understood to prevent buses from traveling through, and probably that lower income New Yorkers would have needed to travel by bus versus having a private car. And this was especially the case. These bridges were especially low, leading out to beaches and parks and sort of pleasure type facilities in New York. So if you build the bridge low, the buses won't be able to pass, therefore it becomes sort of the playground for the rich, or oftentimes the playground for the white, right? So that's, it's something that, we use all the time, these bridges and these roads and these, parks and that sort of thing, but starting to think about, oh gosh, this really awful and really despicable history behind it. It's striking, and I think something that as designers we need to understand and think about. How do we reconcile with this? How do we move forward if we're involved in a project like this? How do you reconcile for these awful building projects of the past, and maybe create something, or hopefully create something that's more positive for the community? So, something to think about. Other examples are white norms in design. So thinking about skin tone on products like bandages and hearing aids and tensor bandages and makeup and that sort of thing, that it's often or traditionally being designed for white skin, especially in, I guess, mainstream products. I know that there are, bandages for all skin tones that have been designed, and hearing aids for all skin tones that exist, but it's harder to access these products. And, for example, on Walgreens here, I just went on the website and was looking at bandages. Those don't come up, right? Certainly not on not in the first line, not on the first page, right? And that's an issue, thinking about, and it raises this idea that yes, we can, as designers, create products that address concerns, or address problems, or address populations that have been left out or mistreated. But then ultimately, how do we put them into effect, or how do we make sure that people have access to them, or that they're available in the places that we need them to be, right? Like on the Walgreens website. Another example is cultural appropriation. And that's something that there's a lot of conversation I think about in graphic design. So, or Urban Outfitters. I'm choosing them because there's a pretty high profile discussion about them, but I'm sure that this could apply to a lot of different companies. But they had a series of Navajo inspired prints and products, t-shirts and underpants, as you see here. And taking prints from the Navajo Nation without permission, without understanding of what, these prints, the history and the traditions behind these prints or the meaning of prints, etc. And without profit sharing, so just taking them and applying them to these products without permission and giving back to the community, right? And I think that this had happened back in, or these were released back in maybe 2008 or 9, and it's still ongoing. So there's this BuzzFeed article that says here from 2015, Urban Outfitters is still fighting the Navajo Nation. So thinking as designers about cultural appropriation, about when we can borrow designs from different cultures and different communities, when that's appropriate, when it's not appropriate, and how to do that respectfully. What kind of permission is required, or what kind of processes should we go through, if it's even, our place to do in the first place. So I've dug down below a lot of designs and a lot of reference points that we take for granted, or maybe haven't taken the time to think about. And these have just been some examples. We can find many, many, many more, right? These are just a few that I am flagging. But that's not to say that designers haven't been addressing these links. There's a lot of more promising designs out there, or there's a lot of examples of ways that, designers have engaged with these issues and have countered them, or have created some really positive and really empowering type artifacts in a place where maybe these reference points weren't so positive in the first place, or in a place where there was a lack or there was a need, right? So I'm going to give two examples just to sort of counter, I suppose, the discussion so far, and kind of just say, if this is something that is important to you, there are these abilities for you to move forward in an empowering or more positive way. So this is the Accessible Icon project, and just a screen capture from their website. So the accessible icon, or the symbols basically that we have for disability, and the one that we use oftentimes is this icon of a wheelchair, right? And there's a lot of discussion about that. I believe it came, I don't remember the date. I think it was the mid-century, the mid-20th century. But initially was designed without a head, which I think speaks to and sort of an understanding of, or a perception of disabled people at the time, where it was maybe not seen as a person, or maybe not seen as sort of an independent individual worthy of, I guess, representation. So it was just this form without a head, and then they added a head, right? But there is a conversation about whether this is the right icon to be using, because it's, representing all disability through a wheelchair. And, there are a lot of disabilities, and I think something like only 1%, or I can't really remember the percentage, but only a very small percentage of people who have disabilities are actually using wheelchairs. Another big critique of the wheelchair icon is that it's quite passive, so it's just a person sitting there, right? And the Accessible Icon project here what they've done is they've redesigned it and made it a lot more of an active person or an active image, where this character is wheeling the wheelchair, they're looking engaged, they're moving, right? They're not just sitting there. And I like this picture because it shows the difference between the previous design and the current, or their proposed design. But if you go on their website, they have all sorts of different signage, and I think that the idea of accessible icon extends beyond just this particular sign, and they're designing a lot of different signage possibilities and kind of investigating this topic really deeply. So that's a very exciting project that's happening. Another neat design or company is Bindle and Keep, and they design, or they're known for making tailored suits for the queer and transgendered community. And they were highlighting a need within that community for sort of a masculine looking suit, a tailored suit, and the fact that a lot of men's suits weren't fitting queer and trans bodies. So they make these masculine type, really structured suits that are, tailored specifically to the individual's body, and by making adjustments and that sort of thing. And I think that's a really cool project, which is just basically, and it links really strongly to semiotics and signs, right? So sort of, what does the silhouette, of the clothing that you're wearing say about you, right? And your identity, and it's so important. And if you want a certain silhouette, which, we understand, what these silhouettes mean and these reference points. If you want a certain silhouette and you're having to either not find one, or you're finding a certain suit and it's not fitting properly, or it's not being flattering, that's not a very empowering experience, and we can do better, right? So I'm gonna show a clip, I guess the promo to the Bindle and Keep. There's actually a documentary about the company, which is kind of cool. So we're gonna watch the promo to that. I think it's only about 2 minutes.
No one contacts us and says, I want it fitting. They usually say, this is my story.
For a lot of people with all kinds of bodies and identities, clothes can make or break every day of their lives. What makes us become a woman? I don't want to become a woman.
I don't want anyone to be like, there's curves on this body that don't make sense.
I don't love female pronouns, but I don't feel any more comfortable in male pronouns. I don't feel like I need to point tits.
Even though life changes, I won't be alone.
I've never liked what I've seen.
I really appreciate it.
I get to be whoever I want.
Everyone has a right to themselves.
You look amazing.
I think the full documentary is available on Canopy, which is spelled with a K, and that's a database that we have access to at SU. So if you just go on the library website and look under databases and look for Canopy, you can watch the whole thing if that's interesting to you. I haven't watched it yet, but I'm looking forward to doing that. So what has this whole conversation highlighted? And what are we going to do now? It's highlighted the need to sort of investigate myths and to continue doing that moving forward. When we're drawing on them in our work, do think about, these reference points, and do the research. It's really important. And thinking about studying or digging deeper below norms or assumptions or stories behind artifacts. That's a really valuable process. And what's really important also is forming your own opinions. So, I've given some examples of things that I think are important, and I think are worth discussion. You can find more examples that I've missed, right? You can have an opinion on these examples different than what I've talked about. You can form your own opinions as well about how you feel about them and about how you think we should move forward and how you think, you're going to react or engage with them as a designer. So it's an interesting process. It's an ongoing process, and it's something that I think it's important just to think about throughout your career and throughout your sort of development of your professional ethics and your professional practice. Kind of who do you want to be as a designer? And there's no answer that I can give you, and just it's just worth thinking about for yourselves. So don't forget to prepare the response to the question I asked earlier in the presentation. And I'm looking forward to having a discussion with you guys about some of these examples in class. See ya.